Now that we've talked about some of our language milestones and some of those general theories of how we might be acquiring language, it's time to go back and really talk about the structure of language itself. So, within this structure of language, there's a hierarchy. Basic sounds are combined into units that have meaning, and those units with meaning are combined into words. Those words are combined into phrases, and phrases are combined into sentences. So they build and build and build and get larger and larger. But if we start at the smallest of these units, we can talk about phonemes. And these are the smallest units of speech. So these are sort of individual sounds that can be produced. And across all languages, there's an estimated 100 possible phonemes that can be made. In English, we use about 40 of them. Typical languages use somewhere between 20 and 80, so there's quite a variety in the number of phonemes used by each language. And so, as we said, our smallest units combine into slightly larger units, which brings us to the morphemes. And these are the smallest units of meaning within a language. So, not just smallest units, but now there's meaning associated. So these consist of root words, prefixes, and suffixes. So if we think of the letter S, it's more than just a standalone sound. It actually includes meaning based on giving us the plural of a root word. So by providing pluralization, it provides meaning to a root word. So that's why S can actually count as a morpheme. In English, there are up to 50,000 different morphemes. So as we combine things together, we get more and more variety in what we can combine them into. The next of our units is actually up to words. So I'm actually going to flip to the next slide here. So we started at our phonemes, then we got our morphemes. Now we're into words. And so words are words. We should know the definition for words. And for words, or relating to words, we want to take note of the term semantics. And this is when we look at the meaning of words and word combinations. So learning semantics involves learning the variety of objects and actions to which the words refer. So when we talked about the example of the written word dog relating to a physical dog, that would be its semantics. The semantics of that word, dog, are the meaning, dog. And our next thing up from that, so from words we go to phrases. So putting words together into phrases, and then we can put phrases together into sentences. So this is our whole structure of language. But we can also talk about syntax, which is the system of rules that we use for arranging our words into sentences. And different languages will have different rules for their syntax. So do they put verb or subject first in a sentence? That will depend on which language we're looking at. And then one more thing we might want to talk about is grammar, which are sort of related to syntax, but this is sort of a larger concept. So grammar is the systematic rules of a language. So grammar includes the words, the tenses of those words, as well as the syntax, the combining of those words into an ordered sentence. So grammar is the more overarching principle there. Now, from this concept of the structure of language and how we put all of those components together, we're actually going to take a bit of a pivot and look at some of the structures in our brain that are involved in our production and the processing of language. The first of these areas is called Brocas Area. And so this is all going back to when Dr. Broca was treating a man who had been kicked in the head by a horse. So this is a case study, a single individual who experienced a pretty severe trauma, and at first it didn't seem like he had suffered any lasting damages, but as time went on, his condition worsened, and eventually he lost his ability to produce speech. And the only thing he could say at the end was the word tan. So he came to be known as Patient Tan. Now, when someone has difficulty or is completely unable to produce speech, we'll say that they have aphasia. That's what we would classify that. In this specific situation, this individual had what we now call Broca's aphasia, which is difficulty with the motor production aspect of language. So he struggled with physically producing the movements and the sounds that allow him to produce language. This is also referred to as non-fluent aphasia because he's unable to produce words and sounds fluidly as he would need to. And after this individual had died, Broca was able to look at his brain and determine where he had suffered most of the damage that would then be associated with his loss of speech. So most of the damage was focused sort of here in this greenish colored area, so mostly on the frontal lobe and the lower area. So that's now called Brocas area. And they assumed that this was associated with his inability to speak. And there were two things that we learned that were very important coming out of this case study. The first of these findings is that there seems to be an area of the brain that's controlling speech. So that's the area that we now know as Brocas area. The other thing that we learned was that language production appeared to be controlled by the left hemisphere. So in this situation, our patient Tan was only injured on the left side of his brain, and yet that still impacted his ability to produce speech. And future sort of case studies and other experience, we've found that most people, in fact 9 out of 10 people, have what's called hemispheric lateralization of the control of language. And so when we talk about hemispheric lateralization, we're really referring to the fact that some functions, in this case language production, are mostly controlled or dominantly controlled by one hemisphere of the brain rather than the other. So most people have their language controlled in the left side of the brain. And the people who don't have it controlled in the left side of the brain, it's sometimes right dominant, but more often than not, it's actually sort of diffused and equally spread between left and right hemisphere. But that's sort of special cases that go beyond the span of today. The other important area of the brain that we want to talk about is called Wernikes Area. So in this situation, it's kind of the sort of the pair to go along with Brocas area. And in this case, Dr. Wernicke had a patient who could produce speech, but the speech they produced was nonsense. So they weren't making any sense, but they could do the motor functions that were involved. So this would be called Wernicke's or fluent aphasia. So they're having trouble with the meaning, but not with the motor function part of it. In this case, the patient had suffered damage to their temporal lobe, so on the side of their head, also on the left, so still in line with that idea that language seems to be controlled on the left side of our brain, and this area seems to be responsible for speech comprehension. So whereas Broca's area is responsible for producing the actions and that motor component of speech, Wernicke's area is involved in comprehending and sort of putting together meaning along with speech. And so if we can look at the orientation of both areas together, the current idea is that Wernicke's area, along with other areas of the temporal lobe, help contribute to processing and differentiating between different sounds. And then they pass information along to Broca's area, and Broca's area is responsible for forming a response or for communicating something back. So there seems to be sort of this movement between Wernicke's area and Broca's area, and that is sort of the very basicest form, or most basic, of our language system, at least in terms of production.